Okay, so this lecture is on Chapter 11 of your textbook on the forces of evolutionary change. Biological evolution. The term evolution just means change over time. That's what it literally means. In terms of biological evolution, we're talking about change in organisms over time. Evolution to Charles Darwin was what he defined as descent with modification, in that organisms are different from their parents. This is based upon the mixture of the DNA that occurs during meiosis, and not only the mixture of the DNA of the individual parent, but the mixture of the two parents' DNA with one another. And it also accrues from the genetic changes that occur through mutation as well. Another definition of biological evolution is change in genetics of a population over time. And that's the key thing, is that evolution works on populations, it doesn't work on individuals. Contrary to things like X-Men and other sort of fantastic storylines which involve people being mutated by things and having superpowers. I don't know if X-Men follows that logic, but Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles did. Those things don't happen in reality. Another definition which is important for you to know is population. It's a group of individuals which interbreed with one another. Populations are, once again, what truly evolve over time. So the human population really is generally one population of roughly around 6.57 billion people at the time this lecture was made. There are a couple isolated groups of people on the earth, but not many at all. We're all one big population. But for example, there can be several different populations of zebra in Africa, or several different populations of tigers in Asia. And each one of these populations of organisms interbreed with one another and have fully functional offspring. So the history of evolution, a lot of people think evolution, they think Charles Darwin, they don't think of other people. But the idea of evolution is something that's been thought of throughout the ages of civilization. One of the first people that we have documented evidence of coming up with the idea of evolution was Anaximander, who lived in ancient Greece. His whole premise was that organisms change over time through transmutations, and one of the driving factors for him to come up with this idea was the fact that human infants are born so helpless that he couldn't imagine a human infant lying there in the ground and being able to fend for itself. His premise was that humans evolved from another species of organisms which had more precocious young, and at one point the young were more vulnerable and more dependent upon the parents, and the parents were there to take care of the young. Aristotle, on the other hand, had the idea that organisms were fixed in form and fixed in structure. A giraffe is a giraffe, an elephant is an elephant, etc., since the beginning of time. And Aristotle's thoughts dominate for roughly about 2,000 years after his death. So one of the first things that began to challenge the idea is that organisms are the same over all time was the finding of evidence of previous organisms that exist in the past that don't exist today. Dinosaurs are the classic example of this, but this doesn't just include dinosaurs, this includes things like trilobites, sea scorpions, primitive fish, primitive mammals, a variety of different amphibians. There are many different organisms which exist in the past that don't exist now, and it's estimated that 99% of all life over the history of the Earth's experience have gone extinct over time, and the biota that's existing today, the flowers, the plants, the animals, etc., all came from, or are representing 1% of the total amount of life that ever existed. So this started changing the way we thought about things, these fossils finding in the ground. So evolution is a very complicated subject. It's much more complicated than people think it is. It involves many forms of science to help support it. And geology is one of those sciences. In the past, there was a thought process of what we call catastrophism. That is, the idea that the geological features of the Earth are created by massive single events that occurred very rapidly. Huge volcanoes, big global worldwide floods and things of that nature were the thought processes that created this whole process. So later on, James Hutton came up with the idea of uniformitarianism. And the idea of this is that things occur gradually through extensive periods of time. And the premise was that he noticed that rivers lay down layers of sediment on a yearly basis. And then noticing the cliffs off of Scotland and England, he noticed this layering. And what he could envision was that this layering was produced over long periods of time in very gradual increments. Since then, his theory has been supported and through previous through observations after his work through the last couple hundred years. I mean, we can see the seafloor spreading in the Atlantic Ocean due to volcanic activity. The Pacific Ocean is slowly becoming smaller while the Atlantic Ocean is slowly becoming larger. Mountains erode through time. The Himalayas are growing as India was once attached to Africa, Australia, South America, and Antarctica, and eventually slammed up into Asia. When it did that, it produced Himalayan mountains, which are growing as India continues to move its way upwards into Asia. So another thing that James Hutton came up with called the principle of superposition, and this is the general idea that lower layers of Earth are older than the top layers. This can be tricky due to geological events. Through processing, layers get folded on top of each other, mountains erode away at the top. So you may have some layers that are more vertical than horizontal, and sometimes they get flipped on top of each other. So, but in general, you can count on the lower layers of Earth being older than the younger layers. Another thing about George Cuvier's idea is that it lost out due to lack of evidence. There was no evidence to support his ideas of catastrophism. So in the 19th century, there's a French researcher named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he came up with the theory of acquired characteristics. And what he suggested is that species evolve based upon what they do throughout their existence. His premise was that what you did in your life would translate to your offspring. So if you start running today and run throughout the rest of your life, your offspring will become good runners. Giraffes have long necks, according to Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, because the giraffes in the past stretched their necks trying to reach leaves that were higher up. His premise also was they cut the tail off a mouse, and the offspring wouldn't have tails. Now, for the most part, this has been disproven, but there's actually some evidence today that some of his ideas may, in direct nature, have some truth to it. Not that you stretch your neck will grow longer or something like that, or you'll pass on your offspring, but there are some things that occur in your life that can alter your DNA, and you can pass it on to your offspring, like stress and things of that nature. But it's not quite the same thing that he came up with. DNA wasn't known. To give you the truth about giraffes, the reason why giraffes evolved their long necks is because of the way they fight with each other. The males tend to slam their heads against each other, sort of like a roundhouse punch. And they swing their necks, and the giraffes with the longer necks could generate more power, which meant they were the ones who were able to procreate. And eventually you had giraffes with long necks through this process. And other processes too. By random chance, the correct mutations occurred in some of these animals, which led to slightly longer necks. Those with longer necks won the battles. There's no guarantee that it's going to happen this way, but it did happen this way by process of chance and by natural selection at the same time. Okay, so James Hutton had a student named Charles Lyell. He came with more evidence to support uniformitarianism, and he began to suggest Earth was more in the millions of years old, if not hundreds of millions of years old. Turns out billions of years turned out to be more accurate later on, but this is his best estimate based upon the evidence that he had, based upon the layering of the sediments and the formation of mountains and things of that nature. He didn't know that mountains went extinct, mountains came together, that continents moved. all these other pieces of evidence we have later on. And then on top of that, you have radioactive dating, which really cemented the um, the idea that the Earth is billions of years old. Charles Darwin. Okay, this is the person we often think when we think of evolution. Actually, his grandfather, Rasmus Darwin, also came up with the possibility of evolution. Um, Darwin's family was a very rich family. He didn't really have to work at all his life. It didn't mean he didn't want to be productive at all. He went to school and all, had a tough time at school because he had trouble staying focused. He was a collector by heart. He collected things like beetles, and he took note of their differences between species. Now, you may sit around your home and the beetle may go scurrying across the floor or at school or something, and you think beetle, and you squish it or kick it away or run away from it or whatever, or maybe sit there looking at fascination. But when you start collecting these beetles, you start noticing the differences in them, which you may not notice when you just try to step on it. And these sort of things are the things which basically led to his idea of evolution. Later on, he was invited to go on the Beagle, the HMS Beagle. It was a ship that was doing research around the world. It was collecting samples from various sites, geological and biological. In this time period in the 19th century, it was popular for major cities of Europe to establish natural history museums, and many voyages were sent out by many of the European countries to collect things from the variety of the world. And it was a big status symbol to have this collection. Well, Darwin went on the ship as sort of the gentleman companion to the captain of the ship, Fitzroy. And he was there because at the time the captain didn't have anyone really to converse with. They didn't converse with the crew. They weren't really friends with the crew. So it was common to bring a couple, a person or two on board the ship for the captain to be able to have discussions with and sort of have a friendship with and everything. When they landed in South America, around what is now Brazil, the ship's naturalist became ill and he had to depart, and Darwin took over the role as the naturalist. And he made many collections, the most famous ones being those in the Galapagos Islands, but he made collections in South America, New Zealand. Matter of fact, there's a tortoise in New Zealand that 5 or 6 years ago passed away, of which it was thought that it was a tortoise brought by Darwin from the voyage of the Beagle and left there. So this tortoise would have been at least like 170 years old, if not older. It's not uncommon for the giant tortoises of the Galapagos to live such extensive periods of time. After his trip, he was sorting through his collections and started making sort of observations that the organisms in the Galapagos looked similar to the organisms in South America, with variations in them. The finches, for example. Actually, the finches were studied by a group who came to the Galapagos Islands 70s or 60s, somewhere like that, and been studying ever since. Darwin was more famous for studying the mockingbirds of the Galapagos Islands. But he started making notes that the organisms from the Galapagos appear like the organisms of South America, with variations in them. There are more species in the Galapagos than there were in South America, and that's because when the organisms got there, they could change and take up new habitats that they hadn't taken in South America. So there were some readings that helped Darwin's. One was an economics paper by Thomas Malthus, and Malthus was an economist of the 18th century, and he basically took note that as the European population was growing, that eventually there would only be so much that Europe as a whole could support in terms of food, shelter, living space, etc. And his premise was that the population continued to grow, it would eventually crash. There would be competition for resources. Some people would survive, some wouldn't. And then one of the books that Darwin took with him on the voyage of the Beagle was Charles Lyell's book, Principles of Geology, which agreed the hypothesis of the Earth was much older than what it was previously thought of being. And with this, it gave Darwin sort of inspiration that there's lots of time. If there's lots of time, then organisms could change into different forms between within populations between generations. So Darwin's mechanism was twofold. One was descent with modification, the idea that organisms never appear the same. You can look at every organism that's sexually reproduced across the globe, and they all appear different from each other. Some appear more similar than others. Now, identical twins, identical triplets, things like that, they all come from the same sperm and egg, so they're essentially the same organism. They just split during development. But more organisms are born than capable of surviving. For example, one starfish will lay 2.5 million eggs. Not all those eggs survive to fruition, survive to adulthood, survive to be able to reproduce. The vast majority of them don't. And if they all did, then what would happen is you'd have an ocean full of starfish in no time and no water. So Darwin lacked some information, though. He didn't understand the source of our traits. He hinted at the idea of genetics. It was Gregor Mendel came up with the patterns of genetics, and it was later on in the 20th century when we discovered DNA and the function of DNA. But this was a limitation of Darwin, and he admitted that in his book, The Origin of Species, that he was incapable of knowing how the traits were passed from parent to offspring. But there were traits passed, and every individual was different. So there were modifications between parent and offspring generations. The other mechanism was natural selection, and it simply states more organisms are born than capable of surviving. Those that survive carry their traits on and pass it on to the next generation. The key thing is natural selection acts upon organisms' phenotypes. Now, your Learn Smart program, I know there's a question in it that says, what does natural selection act upon? And the answer according to it is genotypes, but it doesn't act upon genotypes. It acts upon phenotypes. It acts upon the outward expression of the genetics. So, like, for example, if you're a heterozygote and you carry an albinism allele in your genome, okay, but you have the regular gene as well, and you're living in an area where albinism would be particularly bad because you'd stand out. Well, the thing is, the fact you're a carrier, but natural selection can't act upon that. Okay? What natural selection can act upon is if you pass on your offspring. If your offspring have the albino phenotype because you and your mate both have or carries the albinism, or one of you are an actual phenotypical albinism person as well, then natural selection can act upon that. So recessive traits, even though they're bad, can stay in a population through heterozygotes through extremely long periods of time. Tay Sachs is another good example of an extremely deadly recessive disorder that stays in the population because if you're heterozygote, you're all right. You're not going to be killed by it. So, but natural selection acts upon phenotypes, and that picture right there of the two moths is a classic example of natural selection, of which the moths come in two varieties, a light-colored and a very dark-colored in this particular species. In Germany, the trees are lightly colored, so the lightly colored moths are much more abundant, and then when industrialization began and trees became covered in soot, the dark-covered moths became more prevalent because they can hot blend in against the soot along the trees. At least that's the premise how it goes. So another thing that Darwin noticed is the idea we call artificial selection. This is the selection caused by deliberate human interactions, humans deciding which organisms reproduce, which ones don't, and thus changing allele frequencies within the population. We've domesticated animals, cows, horses, pigs. We've domesticated plants, wheat, corn, barley, lots of fruits. Okay? All these things, we've selected the organisms to breed, and what we've led up to is organisms that produce more milk, organisms that produce more meat, organisms that produce more wool, organisms that produce bigger ears of corn and bigger apples, etc. Cows weren't always the way they are now, but they came to be this way because we selected which organisms breed with which organisms. And through that time, now we have these animals. Now we even inundate that even more with hormones we put in and antibiotics we put in the animals as well, which isn't necessarily changing their genetics, although it can change their genetics through stress, but we've actually sort of amped them up, given them away sort of a form of like agricultural steroids. So, Probably the most famous biological book ever is The Origin of Species, and the full title is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, the Preservation of Favored Races, and the Struggle for Life. Um, favored races is a part of it that's often misconstrued. It's often thought of the ethnicities of our population, but what he's getting at is a term used in biology that means varieties of a particular species. So, for example, there might be some zebras with thicker stripes than others in other populations, for example. So, and he didn't talk about humans in the origin of species. He had like one line or a couple sentences about human evolution in there. He didn't want to talk about human evolution because he thought that it would rock the boat too much, and he really had trouble getting the book published to begin with because he didn't want to rock the boat. Darwin wasn't the one who wanted to push his theory out there in the populace. And this is one of the things I love about Charles Lyell, who disagreed with Darwin about evolution, but Lyell proved to be a true scientist because even though he disagreed with Darwin, he pushed Darwin to present his data. He said this needs to be put out there, this needs to be discussed within the scientific community. And The Origin of Species really took off after that. And once it was published and once it was talked about, it really took off because it changed the way we view life. It changed the way we view living organisms. It changed the way we view ourselves. And my last line, no book's been talked about by so many people have never read it. I happen to agree with that comment that lots of people talk about it, but very few people have actually read the book itself. I read it. I'm a biology nerd, so I don't think that's too much of a surprise. But if you're a biology nerd too, you should try reading it. So evolution is interesting because it's both a fact and a theory. The same thing as gravity is both a fact and a theory. If you pick something up and you drop it, that's a fact that happens. The fact that we're all different from our parents is a fact. The fact that mutations occur, etc. The theories of evolution are the explanations of how observed occurrences of evolution occur. That's what theories are. They describe the mechanisms of how things occur. And there are many different theories of evolution. They're not competing with each other necessarily. They are just describing different aspects of evolution. There's a lot of talk among scientists over which theory is most important or which one isn't, which one is more influential in evolution, which one isn't. I'm not really worried about that. The modern synthesis is one such theory, which came out basically in the 40s. Was when it first came out. Theodore Dobzhansky was a major proponent of it. The whole premise is that mutations of DNA over time accumulate and create changes in populations. This goes along with Darwin. Darwin thought gradual change was probably the most likely events that occur. So there are two terms here, microevolution and macroevolution. They're often mistakenly separated from one another. They're really the same thing. They're just looking at things from different perspectives. Microevolution is used to describe the evolutionary changes that occur between parents and offspring, between generations over time, versus macroevolution is the cumulative effect of microevolution over large periods of time. In the picture there, you see that we have some lizards down there, and lizards in the picture lead to birds. It's a gross oversimplification. The lizards on the bottom really are representative of stem reptiles, not really lizards, which led to dinosaurs, and dinosaurs led to birds. But it's a good picture. I like it because it shows sort of the gradual changes that occur within animals that lead to them becoming from one group to another group of organisms. So adaptation is something that occurs which gives an organism a selective advantage over other organisms. There's always struggle for survival. It's just true of life itself. Human population things are a little different, especially here in the States where we have so much. But even here there's still some struggle for survival. But the key thing is certain organisms have adaptations and others don't. Just because an adaptation is good now doesn't mean it's good in the future. Adaptations sometimes are beneficial at one point and aren't later on. The light skin or the light amount of melanin within Northern Europeans, for example, was a major advantage back in the past because they would soak in order to get enough sunlight for vitamin D. it was difficult because it's north, it's cold, you have to wear lots of clothes to keep your body warm, which means you're covering your body up. Even in the spring and fall, it's quite chilly, and you still have to wear lots of clothes, and your body still needs vitamin D. So, on top of the use of milk, which is a very a European thing to a big degree. Let's use in other countries by far, but I mean other continents. But it with the less melanin in the skin, you get more vitamin D from the sunlight that was available at the time. So adaptations play a part. Um, Adaptations, though, occur through mutation and through genetic recombination between organisms when they do sexual reproduction. So natural selection, once again, is evolutionary theory which explains how populations are shaped. I like to think of this like the way I think it was Da Vinci who made the sculpture David. If I'm wrong, um, please forgive me. But whoever made the statue of David, when it was formed, they said someone was remarking about the beauty of it and everything. And the sculptor said, it was in the stone, I just took it out of the stone. That's sort of like the way natural selection is. Natural selection is limited based upon what is available for it to work upon. And it'll take advantage of certain things, and certain things will be left behind. That's the unfortunate truth of natural selection. But acts upon phenotypes, and it shapes populations. Now, often what happens to populations when there's an extreme change in the environment is they'll go extinct. They won't have the proper adaptation. Polar bears right now are facing extreme problems in the north because as earthworms, they're having problems being able to adapt to these changes because they're adapted to cold weather climates. Not only that cold weather, but icy cold weather climates, lots of snow. Is there a chance they could adapt to this? Yes, there's a chance, but chances are they won't. So often when there's massive global changes, for example, there's what we call mass extinction events, where lots of organisms go extinct and only a few are able to survive, and they take over and they, through evolution, change and the world's ecology changes. Another thing is natural selection has no goal. There's no set form natural selection is guiding upon. There's no known mechanism to tell how to mutate. Mutations are random by nature. But at the same time, it's kind of weird because it's random, but yet it's also shaped in a way through natural selection. So just because you think an organism should change one way in order to survive doesn't mean it's going to happen. So the environment's dynamic. It's always been changing. Antarctica used to be warmer. It used to have tropical organisms on it. It used to be up closer to the equator than it is now. The whole world was different during the age of the dinosaurs. The modern idea is that it was a much warmer climate back then than it is now. Warmer climates mean lower oxygen in the atmosphere. Lower oxygen in the atmosphere means you need a more efficient breathing system in order to be able to survive. Mammals have a rough time with that. We don't have an extremely efficient respiratory structure, but birds and dinosaurs did. The respiratory structures were much more advanced. So they were able to survive in the sort of environment that natural selection favored them. And mammals were restricted to small and isolated populations. As a matter of fact, the biggest mammal throughout the Mesozoic, that's basically Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, we're about a meter in size. So survival of the fittest. This is a term which has been used a lot, but never been very well used. It's a term that's often associated with Darwin, but he never said it. One of his supporters said it later on. But the fittest doesn't mean the most intelligent, the best looking, the strongest, the best whatever you think of. It just means the one that's able to reproduce. I'll give you a good example of that. So fish, for example, there are populations of fish where the males have harems of females that they basically guard from other males. And they sit there and protecting. And the biggest fish, the strongest fish, the fish which you'd think would be the one reproducing all the time, is sitting there fending off all these smaller fish, the weaker fish. On occasion, you have what we called in my theology class in graduate school sneakers and streakers. And these are fish that's sort of waiting on the background as the big male is sitting there fighting off the other males. The smaller, littler male, who's not quite as strong as the other fish, and really their intelligence levels are all the same, will sneak in behind the male that's fighting the other fish and reproduce the females. Now, you might be saying, well, it's smarter because it was able to trick the other one, but it's not really that. It's just the bigger male is inundated with these other males and has to fight off all the time and everything. So it's not necessarily the strongest or the best that wins. It's just the one that is able to reproduce and pass its genes off to the next offspring. So another term which is important to know is gene pool. A gene pool is the total collections of genes found within a whole population. So when we talked about chapter 10, we talked about classical genetics. We talked about the crosses, Punnett squares, things like that, the organisms that breed and how their genetics pass on their offspring. But within populations, we call it a gene pool. And that's the total collection of genes and alleles found in a population. For example, you may have blue eyes or brown eyes or hazel eyes or green eyes or black eyes. You have your own genome. But you within your family has sort of a gene pool. Maybe you have green eyes and your brother or sister has hazel eyes. Okay? Within the human population as a whole, there's a variety of eye colors and hair colors, concentration of melanin in the skin, etc., etc., etc. All these things are based upon the gene pool. And actually, a population is healthiest when it has the biggest variety of alleles within its population. When populations begin to get restricted in the amount of various alleles they have, they'll have trouble surviving if there's changes in the environment. It's one of the problems that polar bears are having. Polar bears are extremely well adapted for the north, for the cold. But that natural selective force has limited their gene pool. Another population of organs, one of my favorites, are cheetahs. Their population has gotten to a point where their gene pool has become very small. And with that, there's very little genetic diversity. So how do we describe the genes and alleles within a population? The Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. It's basically a mathematical construct used to demonstrate the frequency of alleles within the population. Okay, so how often certain alleles are found within the population. So there are two equations there. And don't like stick your head in the sand because there's math being presented towards you. I know a lot of students do that. I used to do that myself as well. The two equations are P plus Q equals 1 and P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. Okay? So the first equation, P plus Q, is a frequency of the alleles found within the population. So P and Q are the two alleles. So for example, let's say they deal with toe length. The dominant allele is short toes, the recessive allele is long toes. So the big P would be the amount of those alleles found in the population. So if you're talking about 100 people, every person has 2 copies of every gene, so there's 200 copies. Let's say 100 of those alleles are the dominant allele, and 100 of those alleles are the recessive allele. So that means is 0.5, 0.5. P is 0.5 and Q is 0.5. They're each 50%, in other words, of the population. Maybe it was different. Maybe one was 150, and say like 150 the dominant allele and 50 the recessive allele. That means 75% of the population alleles are the dominant allele versus 25% are the recessive allele. Okay, and then the equation down below is descriptions of the genotypes. P squared and Q squared are homozygous. P squared is homozygous dominant or homozygous P. Q squared is homozygous recessive or homozygous Q. And 2PQ is heterozygous. Now, if you remember back to the genetics portion of this semester, when we said somebody's homozygous dominant, for example, let's say the dominant allele, let's say we use A's as the allele indicators. So capital A would be dominant, lowercase a would be recessive. Now, if you remember, homozygous dominant would be capital A, homozygous recessive would be lowercase a, and heterozygous would be uppercase A, capital A, and lowercase a. Now, if you look at that equation, P squared is P times P, which is the 2 dominant alleles next to each other. Q squared is Q times Q, which is the 2 recessive alleles next to each other. And 2PQ is 1 dominant allele and 1 recessive allele next to each other. So it really follows the same sort of pattern. And the values you get from p plus q equals 1, you can fit into that equation below, p squared plus 2pq plus q squared, and you can get the frequencies of the various genotypes. So let's go back to p and q each being 50% or 0.5. So in that case, you insert the values into the second equation. So p squared would be 0.5 times 0.5, which comes out to be 0.25. And it means roughly a quarter of the population will be homozygous dominant. 2pq, p is 0.5, q is 0.5, times 2, it's going to come out to be 0.5. 0.5 times 0.5 is 0.25, times 2 is 0.5. So that means 50% of the population is heterozygous. And then q squared, once again, q is 0.5, so 0.5 times 0.5 is 0.25, of which 25% of the population then is homozygous recessive. Those are the genotypes of the population. So what evolution goes through, sometimes what we call genetic equilibrium. That's where the alleles don't really change that much over extensive periods of time. And there are things that have to be met in order for this to occur. One is the population must be infinitely large. And what we mean by infinitely large is we mean it stays stable large. We don't really mean infinite. Infinite's an impossible concept in this case. But we mean, like, for example, the buffalo of the American West back in the 16th century are thought to number between 30 to 60 million. So let's go with the lower estimate of 30 million. Population stays at 30 million for extensive periods of time. No change will occur. Population must be isolated, meaning no genes or no alleles from other populations come in, because if a new allele comes in the population, that can change how that population operates. So remember, p plus q, p is 0.5, q is 0.5. For a new allele, r, say, that would disrupt the frequency of it, and the frequency of allele change is what evolution is. No mutations. And what we really mean here is no mutations which actually cause changes in the population. Whether they're negative or positive, they can create changes, and this will create new alleles and new genes within the population. No new natural selection. Now, if there's a natural selection event that changes the environment that the organisms are in, generally one of three things will occur. Either the change wasn't big enough to create any change, so that wasn't really a new natural selection event. The organisms go extinct because they can't adapt to it, or the organisms change and they are able to adapt to it. So those three things can occur when you have a new natural selection event occur. And the other is random mating, meaning that there can't be one particular phenotype more sexually attractive than another one in the population. So if these five things, or if any of these are not met, then evolution will occur, or extinction is going to occur, one or the other. So far we talk about populations, but populations are often separated from one another. And gene flow is the movement of genes through a population or through subpopulations, through reproduction. Organisms change which herd they stay in, for example. In order for evolution not to occur, genes have to flow through the population. So before we said isolated population, and now I'm saying that populations have to stay together in order for evolution not to occur. So they appear to be contradictory to each other. So let me explain what I'm talking about here. Okay, so if you have two populations, and one population brings an allele into the other population that completely changes the way that population operates, then that could lead to change within the organisms. But at the same time, if two populations stay separate from one another, and there is no gene flow between them, mutations will occur. And if the mutations cause changes in the organisms, then speciation events will eventually occur, and the organisms will be separated from one another, no longer able to breed with one another, and evolution will occur. So gene flow is one of those strange things. So if you can be a non-isolated population, as long as no real true new alleles come between the populations. But if gene flow occurs between populations, then they will maintain themselves as the same species through time. So sometimes there are random changes in gene frequencies that don't involve, say, natural selection. One is called genetic drift. Genetic drift is when a population, through random chance, plummets in population and becomes very small. And with that change, the representation of alleles aren't always going to be equal. So, for example, if you had 0.5 P, 0.5 Q, and the population was 1 million and fell down to 50,000, chances are you're not going to have 0.5 P and 0.5 Q in this case. Chances are it's going to be lopsided, one or the other. Okay, genetic drift often results in a destruction of the allele diversity within the population, and often leads to organisms' demise, the extinction of a species. Founder's effect is similar to that, but it's when a subpopulation gets isolated from the main population. And that's what happened with, like, for example, the birds of the Galapagos. The mockingbirds, for example, are a good example. So are the Darwin's finches, which are famously named after him. But these birds came from South America. They landed on the Galapagos. And on the Galapagos, the populations were isolated from each other, and there's no gene flow between them. And the Galapagos birds began to adapt to the environment they were in, and they changed through time. On top of that, because it's a small population, once again, it doesn't carry the same allele frequency distribution with it. So with these, can lead to changes in organisms. So natural selection, once again, shapes populations. Certain phenotypes are selected for others are not. The two terms, one is called balanced polymorphism. This is when multiple alleles of a gene stay in the population for an extensive period of time because no particular allele provides any selective advantage over the other alleles. Humans are a great example of this, and partially because we change the environment to suit us rather than the environment changes us. So because of that, we can survive in a variety of different places. We would have a tougher time surviving in because our certain alleles would lead to us not being able to survive. It's mainly like we create houses for us that either air condition or warm the environment around us. Okay? We have clothes that protects our bodies not only from the sun but from the loss of heat as well. So there's lots of things that occur there. A lot of organisms don't have this capability. Well, they definitely have the capability to change the environment to suit them. There's minor changes they can do, but not to the level that we can. There's another thing called the heterozygote advantage. Sometimes heterozygotes is an advantage because the recessive allele isn't necessarily something bad, and it's actually good to be kept in the population. Sometimes being heterozygote can be an advantage. For example, if you live in an area of malaria, the sickle cell trait isn't a very good trait in general because sickle cell blood cells do not transfer oxygen around nearly as well. But if you're in an area where malaria is present, then having a regular allele and a sickle cell allele is an advantage because the sickle cells will help keep down malaria. So sometimes the recessive allele isn't a negative. So there are various forms of selection. One we call stabilizing selection. If you notice the two charts, they're right there. The top part and the bottom part, what occurs between the blue and the red occurs later. And this is when the moderate form is selected over the extremes, in which case the population's allele frequency actually becomes a little more narrower through time because one form becomes advantageous over the others. Directional selection is when an extreme becomes supported, in this case. For example, giraffes. Giraffes with longer necks, so the longer and longer necks became the more average of the population. Okay, and through time, that extreme became the most prominent form of the organism. Disruptive selection. These are times where phenotypic extremes are selected for over the average specimen. So both extremes are selected. And I'll give you a good example of that. So elephants are the big animals. Most people know about them. At least I hope you do. They're massive animals. They're pretty amazing. They're one of my favorites. And there's another group of organisms called rock hyraxes, which look like fairly large guinea pigs. If you know what I'm talking about, you should Google them if you don't, if you're interested in rock hyraxes, Hyrax. When I was in Kenya, we stopped at this little way station, and there were rock hyraxes all around. They're begging for food. But rock hyraxes are the closest living relatives to elephants, despite their enormous differences. And what happened back in the past, most likely, is that a disruptive selection event occur, where you had a population of organisms where they went to two different extremes, where the populations basically split from each other, and one extreme went the rock hyrax way, and the elephant went in the other direction. Um, and through this, you had two very different organisms. So another thing which people often think of as like perfect. Everything's so perfect. The environment's perfect. The organisms are perfect. The ecology is perfect. Well, that's not necessarily the truth. Um, the environment's constantly changing. We live in a dynamic world. The environment's changed over the last couple millennia. Um, it's changing right now. It changed in the past. There's been glaciation. There's been lack of glaciation. There have been organisms which are selected for it. North America has seen a drastic change in its biota. Some of the biggest mammals on Earth were found in North America. The giant sloth were huge, but they're no longer in existence because changes in the environment. Organisms are locked in their historical restraints. It's the whole reason why you'll never see pigs fly. Now, there could be, in the far distant future, an organism that's related to a pig that can fly. But the amount of changes that would occur would be too vast for it to happen recently, right now. Changes in genetics are random. We're lucky to evolve. Matter of fact, you're lucky to have been born, let alone evolved. So all these things play factors into it. And even though you may be well-suited now, doesn't mean you're well-suited in the future as well. So sexual selection. Organisms choose based upon favorable mating practices. One phenotype is often picked over another. A good example is the peacock with their large set of feathers. The whole premise is that large set of feathers are the males, and they're saying, look, with these large set of feathers, even though they make me awkward and gangly and all, and I have trouble, running away from predators, I'm still here. I'm still surviving, which means I must be good genetics. So these things play a factor into it. Intersexual selection, members of one gender choose to mate from multiple members of the other gender. It's often the males sit there and put on courtship rituals while the females choose whether or not which ones you want to mate. Some animals have these neat, goofy style of courtships. The blue-footed booby, for example, it's a bird found in the Galapagos, and there are species found in the Caribbean area as well. You should look it up, blue-footed booby. They have these really brilliantly blue feet. And what they'll do for part of their dance is they'll sit there and they'll lift up their blue feet, which look like duck's feet, and they'll show off the blueness of their feet, and the females will select whether or not they want to breed with that one or not. Versus that of the eagles, like the bald eagles, which the males and females lock talons with each other and fall through the sky in like a death grip. It kind of suits what we think of their personalities. Blue-footed boobies being these goofy animals versus eagles being these terrifyingly hunters that are sophisticated and all and everything. But anyway. So, and this often leads to what's called sexual dimorphism. Di means two, morph means shape or coloration in this case. What it means is males and females have different shapes, colors, sizes, things of that nature between the genders. And this is often seen throughout the animal world. If males compete for females, males become bigger. Hyenas are very different. As hyenas, the females are larger. They're the ones who sort of dominate the roost and everything. But so it just depends upon the population, how it works. So mutations play a very important factor in terms of evolution. They add to the genetic diversity. They create new alleles and genes where new alleles and genes weren't present before. An interesting thing is the duplication of genes, which we discussed back during the DNA proteins or mitosis. So anyway, we talked about one of those previous lectures, but sometimes your genes will be duplicated. What that allows for is the duplicated gene, or the original gene, to change, but you have the other copy of the gene which functions normally, so the organism doesn't lose its normal advantage while the other gene mutates and changes, and the organism can adapt to the environment that it's in through many successive generations. So, and on top of that, an interesting thing is there's a big debate over which came first, the chicken or the egg, which came first, DNA or proteins. DNA was necessary to build the proteins, and proteins necessary to build the DNA. So there's a big debate amongst biologists over how life first basically started and evolved. And the thought process is that RNA, which can perform inheritance like that of DNA, and can perform enzymatic operations of proteins are probably one of the original molecules that basically kick-started life itself. Later on, DNA became the inherited molecule because it's more stable and holds information for longer periods of time. So genetic drift is another one of those forces that affect evolution. We kind of touched on this earlier. The one thing I do want to bring up, the bottleneck effect, is when there's a rapid population loss over a short period of time, or reduces genetic diversity once again. Human population went through this. It's hypothesized. I can't remember exactly when, but it might have been like 50,000 years ago, but there was a time period in which the human population dropped to a very dangerously small amount of people, like a couple thousand at most, and over the whole entire world. And from that, we can trace all of our ancestors too. But on occasion, they survive, but often leads to extinction, which is sad in its own right. Founder's effect, we brought this up earlier, but the subpopulation gets isolated from the main population, and then coupled mutations lead to whole new species. So this is something that occurs relatively frequently, especially on islands. If you have mountains separating, new mountain ranges form separating organisms, the new watersheds, rivers, lakes, things like that, isolate organisms from one another. These things occur, and it leads to new species forming. Gene flow, motion of genes through a population or movement through different subpopulations, another thing which creates changes, and it's an evolutionary force. Genes are lost via immigration. Sometimes you lose alleles when organisms leave a population. Sometimes they're gained when other organisms from different populations come into your population. Well,